let's talk about the the migrant women book. Did you come to Singapore to do the research?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
When was that?
Uh, um, the Singapore one is the one that I did there in 2016.
Mm.
What is for a book I'm working now, the Lucky Plaza case study and the fashion as resistance. That's for a
Uh,
book I'm current. That's not yet. The articles have come out, but the book is still not finished.
okay,
Almost.
okay.
Unfortunate.
How many?
But Singapore for
Right.
but the first the Filipino migration book has Hong Kong and some Singapore also has Singapore in it. On
Mm.
the chapter that talks about the Filipino migration and the Filipino family and how the family is the reason why they migrate and they keep sending remittances, but at the same time they see the families exploiting them. That was from interviews with domestic workers in Singapore, who confided that it was a very touching story. They invited me to the birthday party. That's the other thing you need to do to get interviews. You gotta join the. I find that fun. Join the social events with them, and I think hanging around with them gives you the most insightful things. So it wasn't an interview. It was a birthday party of one of them that I attended. That one of them said to me, "Oh, my family keeps asking me for money, and I just wish they would ring me up to ask me how I am."
Mm.
So I used that, but it wasn't in an interview. It was from
Mm.
hanging around. So I find that if you're doing migrants, especially or non-politicians, I suppose, hanging around with them. There was one case where it's in the book that's not yet out that I'm working on now on my women as women's power as consumers. Uh, uh, and so there's a section on uh, um, the Filipino 18-year-old coming of age party that the family spent 5,000 euros for their party, and the uh, I managed to get an invitation to go to it, so to observe the party. And I didn't have a car in Padua, Italy, so somebody who's not a domestic worker, a husband and wife, both Filipino, drove me to the party. And on the way to the party, they told me in Filipino that they can't understand why domestic workers would be scrubbing toilets all day and order to blow 5,000 euros in one night for a big party. And that surprised me, but that shows you that despite the fact that the family is spending this much and showing that they are now middle class status, that they can't remove the stigma of domestic work in it
Mm.
if they are in Italy, because this is a comment from one of the people in the party. So I think doing ethnographic work, if you say oral history with migrants, you need ethnography as well to accompany it, because that's where you get,
Mm.
I suppose, the best insight. The same with the women's movements book, going to the rallies and the demonstrations with them, uh, helped get some of the. I have to tell this story. It's funny. Likhaan, which is this organization on women's health movement in the Philippines. When I was doing that women's movement book, they invited me to go to them to the congressional hearing, uh, um, because they were going to debate the punishment for because abortion is illegal. They're going to debate the punishment they should do for abortion, and since they're as a women's health movement, they're doctors, so they snuck me in as one of them. So there was a table there in front of the congressmen and women around, and they had Doctor so and so doctor. So I had Dr. Mina Roces, like I was an MD.
Mm.
And the whole time I was sweating because the congressmen were interviewing them, asking them when is a fetus, and when is all these medical terms, and they kept looking at me because I was the only one who never said a word. And I kept thinking they're gonna ask me, and I'm gonna have to confess I'm a fraud, that I've been snuck in by the women's movement. And the reason they did this is they wanted me to see the discrimination against them versus the way the people in the pro life were treated, because as you know, abortion is illegal in the Philippines, and anyone who even talks about it is demonized. And this is the women's health movement. But that's again ethnographic work, which again provided an insight. And so I wrote that chapter in abortion. The advocacy for abortion as a reproductive right in the Philippines is still underground. But again, that
Mm-mm.
an experience.
Yeah.
Never forget, because I was freaking out the whole time, thinking they're gonna call me and ask me about a medical term and on prenatal thing, and I wouldn't have a clue. So I think ethnographic work along with migration.
Right, right. Can I just ask you to kind of situate your book in the literature a bit more? So the book is meant to correct certain myths or stereotypes about migrant women. Is that right?
Well, actually, I just wanted to do something different.
Mm.
The dominant scholarship is the image of Filipino migrant as a disenfranchised laborer. And if you watch all the Tagalog films, I collect films on romance, Tagalog romance, and they all laugh at me and say, "How can you watch those cringe-worthy films?" And I say, "But it tells you a lot about gender, masculinities and femininities." But I also collect films on migration, and all the Tagalog films about migration is the migrant is the suffering martyr, and so the trope is always the disenfranchised. So I wanted to write a different story, because there's also another story, and from the migrants who've actually been they've been wanting to write their stories. So I compiled my own archive. I call it the Migrant Archives. And it's the migrants who have written their stories in newsletters of organizations and self-published books and so on. And their story is a story of struggle, but it doesn't end in tragedy. It always ends in a triumph. So I wanted to tell a different story about how migrants experience migration, but nothing to do with labor, about other things in their lives. So how they've changed the family, how they've changed gender norms, how they've actually had power as consumers. I mean, Filipino migrants' money that supports two-thirds, I don't know, a certain percentage of the Filipino channel, for example, all those courier companies, because Filipinos send gifts to the Philippines, it's all because of the migrants. The real estate boom in the Philippines is because of migrant money and so on. So migrants also send philanthropic money to the Philippines. So I wanted to look at the other side, other story of migration that wasn't to do with labor. Of course, you can't ignore labor, because that's how they got there and why they're there overseas in the first place, and how they get the dollars. But I just wanted to tell a different story that wasn't. I was worried, because I thought, oh, I'm going to be attacked in this book, because everybody wants to. The dominant scholarship is that where Filipinos are disenfranchised, and yes, they are. I'm saying they're not, but I just wanted to look at a different side of. They've also become agents of change.
Yeah. Were you ever attacked?
No. They gave me a prize. That's a big surprise. I know it had about 12 or 13 reviews.
Excellent.
I
Excellent.
think
Yeah.
they found it refreshing and different.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to ask you about Facebook and all that, right? The Migrant Archives, a lot of it is already on Facebook, in addition to what they have in their own private collection. A few years ago, when I was writing about the COVID-19 pandemic, I interviewed a lot of the migrant workers in Singapore, both Filipino as well as Bangladeshi and one Chinese even. And it was just about the easiest research I could do. Like, yeah,
because of COVID.
they were so willing to talk to me, and these are the men and women in the kind of more public community, because they were organizing things similar to the women that you were talking about. They were happy to meet me, and a lot of it I already know before I met them, because they were showing the plays that they were doing, the poems they were doing and all that, right? Do you think now that, especially in the last 10, 15 years with the social media and how popular it is, that the idea of the archive has to move beyond the state archive to the social media area?
Absolutely. I agree with you, and I'm glad you like that too, because I thought that we are being too radical, but actually you're absolutely right. I joined Facebook and I never post anything, because I'm a coward, and I think I have to think 10 million times before I post anything, and the copy editor has to check it. But I needed to have Facebook, because that was the only way I could communicate, contact. And also for this one that's not out, I actually had to use Facebook posts, because I wanted to see what they were showing off as part of middle class. Now that they're middle class, what do they show in their in their Facebook pages, and what they show off is their villa in the Philippines, right? And look, I now have an Italian villa in the Philippines, and there's nothing about their house in Italy. So I think Facebook is you're absolutely right. And even it's harder. I think like it's easier to go to a library and just go there because then you're hours looking at this thing and downloading things. But you're absolutely right. It's especially if you're studying self representation, it's a great source. Some people argue, some of the scholarship says it's also a form of surveillance, I suppose you could say. But even the NGOs will tell you. I read this article in the British Library on a Filipino European newsletter called Planet Philippines. And their advice to migrants is if you don't want your family to exploit you, stop sending them lovely pictures of yourself in Facebook. And so, what as a migration scholar, what you could critique about Facebook is Facebook doesn't tell you the truth. So that in the article in Planet Philippines said all these beautiful pictures of them standing up completely coming from the beauty parlor in very nice clothes and branded Louis Vuitton bag. That is a lie. What they mean is that the Facebook doesn't talk about their working life. It doesn't talk about the discriminated against in a foreign country. So Facebook is very good about self-representation, but one is to bear in mind that to ask what is Facebook silent about. And I found from migrants, it's silent about the hardship and the difficulties that they face. They don't want their family to worry, but on the one hand, the family thinks they're so rich and they're having such a great time, which is not true. And that's why the advice column of Planet Philippines was tell your family the truth and stop showing them just this beautiful faces in Facebook.
That's a great point. I mean, and that is where the interview is still important, right? Because that's when you can ask them these questions.
That's right. Absolutely right. And in the interview, for example, I had one person tell me that she was a nurse in the Philippines. And then in Italy, of course, her qualifications are not accepted. So she had to be a domestic worker. And the only way she could cope is to rename the mop and the brush and the toothbrush and the rag as forceps and all this medical equipment she used to use in the hospital. So she'll tell me this in an interview, but she'll never put it in Facebook in her memoirs or in her album. But on the other hand, if you ask for a look at the album, it'll show you all the countries that she's traveled in Europe, which also shows you that in their personal papers that they've also managed to live a middle class life, even if they have what was considered a lower class profession.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions to ask you about like the intersections between gender and labor and the basis of the research. I mean, one of the things that I was always a bit doubtful about, just like self-critical, right? When I was interviewing the migrant workers was, these are the people in the community, right? These are the people who are the more activists, who are the more positive. And there's a great number of migrant workers who have not been reached out, even by these migrant worker groups, right? Because, like for example, in Singapore, language is a barrier, so it's very hard to get Chinese or Vietnamese migrant workers to join them, right? Because mostly the language that they use is English. So I always try to interview migrant workers who are not part of these groups, but quite difficult, right? So most of my interviews ended up being. So do you think that there is still a need to, what about the migrant workers who are not self-representing like that, or who are not involved in these groups to make change? How far can we generalize?
That's a good question. Because it's true. I get the ones that are connected to organizations. Except for in Italy, when I asked the Philippine embassy to help, and they gave me some names. Philippine embassy is very helpful in all my work. So, and then you might get somebody who is not in an organization, but for some reason the Philippine embassy helped them with an issue, and then they have a connection. So, it's possible. But try and get the others. You would have to ask someone who knows someone who knows. I mean, it's a snowball. Somebody in the organization who might know somebody who's not involved. It's always very frustrating when you go to, let's say, Central in Hong Kong or Lucky Plaza, Philippines, and there's so many Filipinos, but you can't just nab them for an interview, right?
Yes.
There's that there's always that, because it's true. You have to. It's difficult to just
Yeah.
get. But one way is to, well, there's one organization in Singapore, the Humanitarian Organization for
Oh,
Migrant
yeah.
Economics. They teach us. They have a school. So maybe those domestic workers, they have Burmese there, they have all nationalities. Maybe the workers who actually don't join the organization but show up in the lesson school, you could get them. How I went to the graduation because one of the MCs was a Filipino that I interviewed. She said, "Come, I'm a big. It's her big day. She's an MC." So I came and they gave me the front row. And then one of the home organizers found out I was a professor at UNSW, and suddenly the person who will give us the inspiring address is Professor Mina Roces. Oh my God, I had like no warning, and I had to kind of stand out there and give this kind of graduation address. But then I realized that that's another way you can get. I mean, everybody knew who I was after that, and I didn't actually ask to do it; it just happened. So I think if you join the not the ones who join the organization, but some of the activities that the organization does, then you can get. But you're right. I'm like the one in Hong Kong. There was an organization that looked after Filipino domestic workers who wanted to become tour guides, to have a Philippine historical tour of Hong Kong. So I joined the tour, and they allowed me to look at all their scrapbook, their personal journeys as migrants. So I got to see that. I was the only historian that ever got to see it. But then I got the link through an organization. So you're right. It's a bit more challenging to get those who are, unless of course you can see the victims. You go to the consulate, and the Philippine consulate will always have a shelter there, and that would be another way.
Yeah. I mean, I guess home and the embassy, they kind of give you the other picture, right? The other end of it, which is the migrant workers who are in trouble, who need help. And so they kind of paint the opposite picture, right? Like if you use their archives, for example, you have all these case files, and it will be a very different picture. So, where can we kind of find the middle, right?
I didn't look at their case files. I asked migrants for their stories. So even the ones I noticed though, that the ones who told their stories, even if they were victims, they don't want to end it like, this woman in Paris, for example, she was a domestic worker who took her employers to court for modern slavery, for not paying her salary, her overtime, and for hiding her passport. She won the case. The Philippine embassy, she said, didn't help her. But she became, because the French labor union was the one who helped her. She became like a star. The first lady of France that wrote her a letter. She became a sensation. She came out on television, where the French crew followed her to the Philippines and back. The union hired her, gave her free French lessons. So the stories that I get are usually they had a struggle, but they succeeded and turned it into some sort of. So it's a heroic narrative. And of course, you say, is it kind of celebratory? Yes, of course it is celebratory. So as a scholar, you'll say, yes, it's celebratory. But that's what they want. And you can understand that they don't want, the point is that they don't want to show themselves as being victims, that as they kind of triumph in adversity. It's kind of, that was the story. So the story that doesn't come out from the case studies is a story that shows they did suffer some victimization, but they overcame it in some way to empower themselves with the help of other organizations.
I want to ask you what you said about the Filipino migrant women. Does that also apply to the men? And in other words, is it also, it's kind of a common migrant experience compared to a gender experience?
Yes, my migration book wasn't just about women, because I wanted to do a gender one. So it's all male and female. But I did have a chapter in how migration changes gender construction, gender ideal, masculine and feminine. But yes, the men, especially the Philippine Americans who have had a longer history, more than 100 years history of migration, they are the ones who publish their stories. And it's the same. because the first wave migration to the U.S. was all male at that time. There was a few women, but very rare. The agricultural workers in 1906 who went to Hawaii and then to California. So that first generation is male. This is another story. My Filipino migration book actually went from 1906 to 2018, but the referee told me to cut 50 years, so I had to rewrite it. But I had a whole section about Filipino American, and that was men and women. So that's so the original manuscript had a lot more on Filipino Americans in the 20s and 30s that I had to remove to satisfy the referees.
Okay, coming back to the books, right? Academics are always told, right? We shouldn't just interview people, go to the field, and then forget about them, right? Like after we've published our work and we've gotten our benefit, right, from the research, to go back to the community. Is this something that you've done throughout your career to engage with these women on a continual basis after the project, to show them your research, and what have they said about the research?
Yes, I've been more in touch with there are only one or two politicians, but I've been more in touch with the women's movements people, activists, and the migrants. I still keep in touch with them. Some of them became really good friends, and one of them, for example, last year noticed that someone had put in Facebook that I was interviewing a couturier, and she said, "Oh, I always wanted to meet that woman. And what's your topic?" So I told her. She said, "I'll get you another interview with another couturier who's my friend." So I mean, that was amazing. But I usually give them a copy of the book. So I ordered. So I think I bought the most books probably of the migration book, and I mailed each of them a copy, so they have a copy of it. And then the women's that one probably not so much impact yet. It's more very recent, but the women's movement book, Likaan, that organization that brought me to the Congress, they have used it for their. I've been asked to write the Amnesty International. It's supposed to be out. They have forgot to send me a copy. December 7th, the Feminist Amnesty International report on the status of women in Southeast Asia. I've been asked to do it, so I'll do it, of course, even though I didn't interview them because it's part of giving back. There was the woman in Torino I interviewed. Her organization, she wanted to ask for funding from the vice mayor, and it's for Filipino caregivers there. And she showed me her speech, and I said, "You want me to write your speech?" She said, "If you don't mind." So I did. So I made it kind of, Filipinos are known as the angels of Turin, so I called it "Who Will Care for the Angels of Turin," and so a story about the employers dying in the arms of Filipino caregivers. And so she read it. She said, "You're gonna make them cry." I said, "But isn't that the point?" But for me, that's a way I could give back. So I write the speeches for them if they need funding and so on. So that's the base. But they do get a copy of
right.
If they sometimes they see a bit of it before, if I want them to check. Okay, check this. Please check if it's okay.
Sure. When the women see their names and see their stories in the book, have they told you how they feel?
It's hard with Facebook. So if I see them, because they few of them they bought it. Except once I got an email from message in Facebook from one of them that said, "My daughter, who's in her 20s, is having a book club, and they want to discuss this book because, of course, her mother's there, and there's a big feature on her mother as a founder of an organization in Italy. My daughter wants to include this book in her book club." So that kind of response you can get. So, but generally, unless you see them, some of them was because that migration book, when it was nominated for a prize, I told them, and they all wrote back and said, "We're praying very hard." But obviously, their prayers are useful. So when I told them that it won the New South Wales Premier's History Prize, I told them it have a chance because the prize usually goes to European history. But anyway, when it won, they called me up in tears because they were. So it's nice to. I feel they're supporting me rather than me supporting them. But I keep in touch still after and let them know so they can see that their stories have had a kind of. They feel that their stories have that matter.
Mm. Yeah.
So I do keep in touch with most of them. Not all, depends.
Yeah. I just have one last question. It's been a fantastic conversation. I love every minute of it. And the last question is not just on gender per se, but on the writing of people's history and social history, right? Like there's always been this tension about victimhood and agency,
Yeah.
right? Like the people's history of the United States. I can never finish reading that book because it's so grim, right? The first two chapters are filled of death, right? And repression and all that. I think there is a need for agency in history. What is your take on writing people's history in the 21st century? I mean, in this millennium.
I'm in the one hand, you can see that for example, just gender. People are constrained by ideal constructions of gender, and they can only go so far, and you can't. And if they radically do it, they might suffer the consequences. So to write this people's history, I see what you mean, because I always see that one referee report criticized the proposal I had that said, "Oh, is it just about the suffering people and or tension?" Because you can see, I think one way to look at it is maybe the people's history. It's about fighting for a space, a space in the city, a space in history, a space in their life, or something, a space in the national narrative, and that's always shifting, and it's not always that they're the suffering, people. They're negotiating for a space to be recognized, to be accepted, or whether it's this in the city as a migrant, city, whether you're doing urban history, or whether it's in the host country as a migrant, so sort of a way to. So maybe if you look at it as as not just resistance, but negotiating a space for them, and to express their identity, but also one where it's give and take. So as a migrant, they also accept the host culture parts of it, so they don't just reject. So it's not just a conflict on one is good and one is bad, but it's a kind of blurred, taking some of this and some of that. And that's what makes it fascinating, because it's not simple black and white. You have to look at what have they agreed to accept, and what have they not agreed to accept, and what has the host country agreed. And the same in a people's history, people think of it in terms of class, but it's beyond class. There's the gender, and there's the other factors that are involved. And I think if you look at it as them negotiating for a metaphoric space to be recognized, the history in any possible way, and they might not be recognized in one, they might be recognized in another. So, for example, if you look at this festival in the Philippines of Christ Child in Quiapo, where they bring the procession, and it's a male thing, mostly men, that carry the statue over the streets of Manila. And then the mayor says you can't go there because it's a hazard. They actually lifted the trucks of the roadblock just so they could pass through. So here, this is a literal negotiation of a space in the city where the people who you consider are the ones without power manage to topple temporarily the people in power. So I think if you look, like you're doing people's histories, that's what you do. If you look at it, for example, that it's not, they can, if you see Lucky Plaza, I see Lucky Plaza as Filipino space only on Sunday. And then in the rest of the week, the Singaporeans take over again, but it's only on Sunday. So you can interpret it as on Sundays, Filipinos can claim that space as their own, but it's temporary.
When are you coming to Singapore again?
I don't know. So I love going there.
Yeah.
Because a female researcher can be by herself, alone. I don't have to. In the Philippines, I have to be accompanied times. I can't just go anywhere alone. I mean, last year I went by myself to the province. I walked into a hotel, and the first thing, they knew I wasn't from the town. Who are you and what are you doing here? And I had to kind of say who I was. I don't have that problem in Singapore. Oh, this is an interesting story you like. When I was in Lucky Plaza trying to see how many stores were Filipino, to see whether we had Filipinos at Consumer Power there, and then on Sunday, so I was taking notes, and none of the Filipinos thought I was Filipino, and the Singaporeans didn't think it was odd you think they would find me threatening? No, it was the other way around. So I asked why, and the Filipinos said I thought it was because of my Asian, my father is Spanish Filipino and my mother is Chinese Filipino, so I thought it might be that. No, it wasn't my racial or my skin. They said it was my sartorial choice. They said Filipinos dress sexy and fashionably. So I knew then I was not sexy or fashionable. And I was letting the whole race down. And Singaporeans dress simply and elegantly. So I think there you go. That's how they thought I was from the Ministry of Manpower, and I thought, oh my god. So then I had to follow to assure them that I was okay. So here, that's one side again. The people can have power for a day but lose it the rest of the week. So I think that's a great example. Like you said, how do you put this history and see the negotiation of power? They can have power even if it's just for a day.
So fashion keeps coming back, yeah?
That was a surprise. Yes, I never knew that my outfit would matter, and that I was fashionable or sexy. That was the biggest blow from a referee. Blow from a referee was that I was not fashionable and sexy. I wanted to say, oh, but I got published in Fashion Theory, but that's only theory, not practice.
Thanks so much, Mina. It's been a wonderful chat. I know you went to a lot of trouble to set this up, more than most of my other guests.
When I told the IT guys, they said, oh, you have to use the media room. It's new. So, okay.
We will catch up in Singapore, right? When you're here. Yeah?
Yes,
yeah. Thank you so much. And I'll let you know when the episode comes out, which will be probably a couple of weeks from now. Talk to you again. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye.